Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and if you are just joining us, I am speaking with Scott Woodward, who is the former Deputy Commissioner of the Vermont Agency of Digital Services and is now a consultant for many municipalities and states and companies across the country. And hopefully, regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser will be jumping in and out of this conversation. Unfortunately, she is having internet issues, which always seems to happen when we talk about anything digital in Vermont. So Scott, before I want to talk about big data, but before we get to that, I just want to quickly touch base with you. You know, in the first half, Emilie brought up that really great point that Vermont is so small as a state that sometimes our economy of scale and how we choose IT systems can be tricky. Can you think of any states or small municipalities that are kind of Vermont size that maybe have tackled that issue of scale well? That Vermont can learn from?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. And I think that we only touched on it briefly, but I think we also have to kind of better define what we mean by scale, meaning, is it the number of IT projects that are in play at any given time and the resources that can do it, that can accomplish those projects, or another kind of yardstick that's good to this is hard to apply to a state, but I've always kind of offered to clients a bit of a yardstick to say, look, you should only have 5 to 6 projects in play at any time. This would be kind of a rule of thumb for an individual business, because it doesn't matter how good you are, whether you're a huge Fortune 500 company or a small business. People only have so much mental capacity, and so it's not just how big the organization or big the state is. There's a certain, I've found, and this is kind of anecdotal, but I found that there's a kind of almost like a mental limit that we all have of how much we can tackle at any one time. And so I've always encouraged, whether it's a big state or little state, to tailor your list to only 5 or 6 key projects at a time. And then everything else after that is just like keeping the wheels turning. And I think there's a tendency, and this goes to the issue of scale, I think there's a tendency to think, well, we're a state government. We can do as much as we want to do. But we're also all human, and we have kind of our own embedded human capacities too. So yeah, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but I think I think less is more is the takeaway.
And what about, I think one thing COVID taught us is it showed us where some of our vulnerabilities were as a state, as far as some of the program we were using. But you know, I think that going back to the Vermont Department of Labor, that surge of use and that surge of need would probably have swamped any system.
Yeah.
What can we do looking forward? What lessons can we learn from COVID to implement for our IT systems so that they might be more resilient to this type of upheaval in the future?
Yeah, really good question. I don't know if this occurs here in Vermont, but I lived in San Francisco. I worked in Silicon Valley for many years before moving to Vermont. And so I worked for a big consulting firm called Booz Allen Hamilton. And when I was at Booz, we came up with a really creative methodology around business continuity planning. So every state, Vermont has one where the state plans for certain disasters to occur, whether it's a pandemic or a major natural disaster, and how the state will continue doing what it needs to do in the midst of a disaster like that. And I think, I don't know this for sure, but what I suspect is the case with Vermont is that that is kind of done at the top level, contingency planning, uh, getting physical resources where they need to be if there's a disaster. But the IT systems are sometimes not contemplate, like, what do we need to do around our IT systems to make sure that they too can handle what might happen in that context. There's some what's called disaster recovery in IT world. That's a little bit of that's different than what we're talking about, because disaster recovery is more about how do we make sure our critical systems are still running and we don't lose any data. But that's a very narrow concept. What you're describing is, how do we anticipate using our IT systems in a potentially different way based on the circumstances? And that's something that I don't think is really contemplated in the business continuity planning. So what I would say is that business continuity planning needs to be kind of broadened out a little bit more to think about, that the whole situation with DOL is a great lesson to say, okay, it could have been a DOL system, it could have been some other system where there's this sudden surge, and we need to figure out how we might deal with that, whether it's extra server capacity or people, or I'm just winging it here, but you could even have like people who are designated development SWAT teams, right? So it's like you and you, when things go really badly, you are our designated SWAT team, and if we have to develop a new system on the fly, you're the ones we're going to grab to do it, because you're our top developers. And they can kind of come in and create systems on the fly. That probably happened. It seems like that's what happened in practice, but actually planning for it too.
Right. And it sounds to me like, in what you just said, that making sure folks have perhaps the training, the skills, the resources to do those things on the fly. So it's a little less trial by fire than perhaps COVID was at times.
Yeah, and to kind of get even deeper into the weeds on that is, I served in the military for a long time, and so one of the things that the military does is it has certain equipment set aside for basically if hotspots occur in the globe. There's equipment set aside. There are processes. There are plans. They aren't exercised. They're exercised periodically, but they're not exercised on a daily basis. But everybody is tagged. Like, someone in the military, it's like, you've got to roll, you've got to roll, you've got to roll. So when something flares up in the world, those people know how to mobilize. They know what equipment they're supposed to go and get, and where, and they're just waiting for their orders. So it's a little bit like that, where almost having the equipment designated, the people, the roles, and the framework existing, and then when something happens, you mobilize those resources and say, okay, now go do what you've been assigned to do and trained to do. That probably exists to some degree within state government, but maybe not quite to the degree it should.
Okay, thank you. Let's change gears just a little bit and talk about data.
Yeah.
And data use. For the sake of listeners, while Emilie was still connected with us, unfortunately, she's had to step away because technology just was not cooperating. But she raised a really good point. She said, with all the collection of data that does happen through IT systems, how can Vermont better use its data for its decision making, for the lawmakers. And yet, how do we also protect our data from just being sold willy-nilly throughout by say big data companies? I'd love if you would run with that, Scott. What are some of the ways Vermont can use it? How do we protect ourselves?
Yeah, two different questions for sure. Probably like the second question first with security, and but that too is a pretty big topic. I think that the simple answer is that particularly dealing with private companies, it really comes down to the contract, whatever the contract vehicle is with that organization, is making sure that there's provisions in that contract, and not just provisions in the contract, but those provisions translate into actual methods of data handling to prevent bad things from occurring. But it's got to start with the drafting of the contract, and to make sure that, for instance, if data is not supposed to be sold to third parties, that's got to be an explicit contract provision and say, don't sell it to third parties, period. And if you do it, you're subject to contract violation. So that's kind of that piece of it. But there's a lot more to the protection, because of course, private organizations can get hacked. So that too is a concern, and that's not something that can be handled within a contract. Periodic audits, right? So if you've got a third party handling data, is maybe another way is to ensure that there are periodic audits of how that data is being handled, things like that. But I'll say right off the top bat, I'm not, in that realm. That is not my expertise. There are people who are a lot smarter than I am, who know a lot more about that subject. My expertise is more on the question about how can the legislature make decisions off of data, and that is generally across the board a subject that a lot of progress can and should be made on. Just to give you a little bit of context, several years ago, I worked with Orange County in California, and I thought they had a really interesting approach to data, and it really starts with a mindset toward data, and I think there's this is just how I feel about it, and I actually kind of wish others in government felt more like this. Some do, some don't. But the way I think about data is, it's not the government's data, it's the public's. I mean, unless there's data that is truly subject to confidentiality, like social security numbers, birth date, things that are absolutely should not be out there in the public domain because they are privacy issues. Otherwise, data that government has is the public's data, and it should be as available as possible. And that's a philosophical viewpoint, but that's one that I hold. And when I worked with Orange County, they too had that viewpoint, that that the data that they had was largely public, and that it was their job to make it available to the public. And so rather than producing periodic reports that could be put on a website somewhere and say, here's this report for this period of time and it's static data, what Orange County did was they created basically it's called an API, application interface, or it basically is a way for the public to go directly to and access data and slice it and dice it any way they want. And Vermont does that in some realms, like the Agency of Transportation does a lot of that. There's a lot of geographical information system data that is like that. So there are pockets within state government where there's a very open perspective on data, but I don't know that it's not perhaps as broad as it should be, in my opinion. And, this is what I would imagine, and I would personally love to see any state accomplish. But imagine a legislator being able to go to, if the legislator wishes, to go to some website, even if you have to log in to do it, and to be able to run his or own reports, to dig into the data, to put it into different dimensions and query it in different ways. Like, really, for a legislator to have the ability to dig into the data as much as he or she wants, to stimulate questions about how government is being run.
So just to use an example to hopefully make it concrete for listeners, let's say we'll just use Emilie as an example.
Yeah.
And her committee's talking about a childcare bill.
Yeah.
And financing childcare. She would be able to maybe go to this website and find out, like, how many people in Windham County actually have childcare, and roughly how much, like a range of what they're paying for it.
Yep.
And then maybe compare it to, I don't know, Franklin County or Orange County or Washington County.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And I think on the one hand, there's always a need for legislators to have, quote, I'm just going to say, official reports, right? Official reports that say that these certain things occurred in this period, and this is what the organization is officially reporting on happened. And that requirement's never going to go away. On the other hand, though, there's that part where, again, Emilie could go and she could do her own analysis. She could dig into the data herself. And it's creating systems in a way that, rather than an individual legislator or committee making a request of some person who then goes back to their organization who says, geez, I need a report on such a data because the legislature is asking for it. And then 2 or 3 weeks go by. And then, people are trying to generate that data for the request. That gets fed back up. Then that data is finally presented to the legislator or committee that asked for it. Imagine if none of that had to happen and a legislator could just, I'm going to go run my own report. I'm going to go run my own data. And it's not just for legislators. Emilie's question was particularly around how could it help legislators make decisions? But it's certainly, why wouldn't you want the public to be able to do their own digging as well? So going back to the top of our discussion in the previous segment, how can the public know and get confidence that they're getting the outcomes that their taxes are paying for, right? So it's not just how am I getting the services that I expect as an individual resident of the state, but maybe someone in Vermont might want to know, hey, I just want to feel confident that the taxes I'm paying are actually achieving the outcomes, and maybe I want to do my own analysis. I don't see that I see that as a really good goal, and to do that means being very open with data, as open as possible without, of course, sacrificing privacy.
Right, which I think, with Vermont's data broker laws and some of the other legislation they've done around data, they have tried to make sure they protect people's privacy, which I think brings us to maybe the next level of this question. One of or I'll back up here. Is there a best practice? Like, how do we make sure we collect the data properly And how do we avoid some of the issues you run into with like algorithms and how they can actually be biased
Yeah,
against different groups or different members of the public? Like, what's the best practice for the state
yeah.
to avoid some of those pitfalls?
I'll be honest. It's a really interesting question, and I have not thought about it. I would love to think about it. It's a really interesting, especially this day and age where I think we're seeing tangible evidence that it actually does happen. It's not hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the simple answer is uh, uh, anonymizing data in a way to avoid, it's there are different ways to do it from a data perspective. One is to create a wholly different data set that is completely anonymized, and then algorithms can be run against that, what I would refer to as sort of a sanitized data set. Or there are ways to build layers on top of the true data set to prevent it from being mined in a way that you're describing. There are ways to do it. And again, it's not something I've thought a lot about, but it's a really interesting subject these days when we're just seeing so much more tangible evidence that it does occur.
Mm-hmm.
And it's yet another facet to this whole big data subject that warrants some really serious thinking.
Mm-hmm. So around questions of big data, and if uh, going forward, what questions around big data do you think the legislature should be asking that maybe they aren't?
Um, yeah, good question. I think um, this may be too in the weeds, and I'm probably coming at this with my IT hat on.
That's why
Uh,
that's why you're here.
but I would, to try and strike at the heart of the issue. If I were sitting in a legislator seat, the question I would ask of almost any organization is how um, how many, you know, the whole reporting landscape that an organization has. How many of your reports are kind of what I'm going to refer to here as like one-off reports that have just a static set of data? How many are there of your whole reporting world? What's the composition of your reports? How many of them are of the kind where it's just sort of a canned static report that shows a certain segment of data? And how much of it is data that can be easily mined and exposed to legislators or the public? What's the breakdown? Is it 70-20 or 70-30? Is it 50-50? Because the reason I pose that is because that would be a pretty strong indicator of how the organization thinks about its data.
Hmm.
Um, and from there, say for instance, the answer is it's actually like 80-20. And if I heard that response, I would say, well, shouldn't you be doing more to be structuring the data in a way that is more open, but at the same time, just as we're talking about, making sure that you've got the right protections in place, that that discrimination, using the data in a way to uh, 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 bolster discrimination can't occur either. But
Mm-hmm.
the precursor to all of that is to have that sort of open data layer.
Mm-hmm.
So legislators really need to get at the heart of how does the organization handle its data in the first place.
Okay.
That,
Scott,
yeah.
Oh, I was going to say thank you so much. We
Welcome.
are just about out of time, and I know we have pulled on many, many threads in this conversation. What would you like to leave listeners with before we go? Any last thoughts or anything you want them to know?
I go back to the beginning of the point that you made at the intro of our discussion, and I really think you nailed it when you talked about how what is the judge of whether a system is in control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you had said whether somebody's getting the intended outcome of the system. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there. And so what I would leave listeners with is be inquisitive and ask legislators and ask your government whether you are getting the outcomes of those systems, and don't be shy, because that's all everybody's paying for it, and everybody should be getting their money's worth out of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Scott Woodward, information consultant, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you have a website. If folks want to see some of the writing you do or the commentaries you have submitted to VT Digger, where can they find that?
It's on a website called forestandwater.com, 1R. But just fair warning to everybody, I write about my dogs a lot. There's a lot of work. But anybody's welcome to visit that website.
Well, for the sake of our radio listeners, yes, there is a very sweet dog sleeping behind Scott right now, and there's a cat over his other shoulder. So yes, this is a pet-friendly household here.
I've got a big posse, yep.
Thank you for joining us, Scott.
Right.
As always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour at 2 p.m. on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on BCTV and our website, the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm. Hey, everybody, have a wonderful weekend.